And today we're going to do a webinar on how to do an agricultural water system inspection and assessment. And this is going to be mostly catered to farms subject to the produce safety rule, which is that federal regulation. But the stuff that we're going to go over will be applicable to all farms that are growing produce, because this is really best practices that all farms should be paying attention to, whether they document these things or not. So I work for the Department of Agriculture, and I do the farm inspections for the farms that are subject to the produce safety rule, which is a federal regulation. And joining me today is Hob Machado from Extensions. I'll let him introduce himself while I load up my slides.
Perfect. Hob Machado here, University of Maine, as Lindsay mentioned. I am one of the food safety, food science specialists. I focus working with farmers and food safety at the farm level. So I partner with Department of Ag and MOFGA for some of these classes, trainings like the produce safety rule training. I'm just finishing a project called Jumpstart, where we help some farmers with their farm food safety plans. I joined Lindsay to do on-farm readiness review. So a lot of technical assistance for farmers. And Lindsay is almost done calibrating her share of portion of the screen. There you go. Looks pretty good, Lindsay.
Thanks, Hob. All right, getting better at it. Do a few of these routinely. So I'm just gonna dive right into it so we can get back out into the sunshine. This is me, and I think I have my contact information on the last slide, but we'll see what I've got on here. Uh-oh. There we go. Okay. So a heads up, from a lot of people may still not know this, but for farms that were subject to the produce safety rule, that federal regulation, the part of the regulation applicable to agricultural water was on hold for a long time. And so it's just been up in the air forever, but it's finally finalized. And you can read the final text of the regulation if you do a search on the internet for 21 CFR 112, that's Code of Federal Regulations. And my favorite link for reading regulations is the ecfr.gov ones. You can click hyperlinks to go back to definitions and stuff when you use that website. So that's why it's my favorite. And so some of the resources for this workshop were emailed out, and it looks like I might have forgotten some of them. I did a table of section number changes that I sent to all farms that had an on-farm readiness review so that they could use the manual they received that had the old citation section numbers, and a way to convert them to the new finalized ones. But maybe you all don't need that. I have it. If anybody on here thinks they need it, just reach out. And so I'm going to skip over this one for a second. So even if your farm is not subject to the produce safety rule, this might still be relevant to you, especially if you participate in a third-party food safety audit. A lot of those require an agricultural water inspection or assessment, might be a little bit different than what is required for the produce safety rule, but there will be a lot of similarities. And all farms that are exempt from the produce safety, whoops, diving off on the wrong end here. So farms that are exempt from the produce safety rule assessments and are subject to the regulation, they still need to inspect their agricultural water system. So maybe they don't have to do part of what I'm going to talk about today, but they will have to do the other part. And back up to this one. So now I'm going to go over, this is just a summary of the finalized subpart E, which is a section of the regulation on the on agricultural water. So basically, agricultural water must be safe for its intended use. The regulation requires inspection and maintenance of the agricultural water system. So that's the whole system, from the source to the point of use. And inspection and maintenance is applicable to pre-harvest water. They're using while the crops are growing, water that you use while you're harvesting, as well as post-harvest water that you might use after harvesting for washing produce or icing produce. Subpart E also requires an ag water assessment, and that's specifically to pre-harvest water. So your irrigation water, your chemical application water, any water that's going to contact the produce. And then harvest and post-harvest ag water requirements. So if you're gonna use water while you're harvesting or after harvest, it has to have 0 E. coli. This did not change from the original rule, so nothing changed when this was finalized. And that 0 E. coli has to be confirmed through testing. You could treat the water to achieve that if necessary, hopefully not. Um, Ag water assessment corrective actions is another section of this finalized part of the rule. We'll go over this later. There's ag water treatment, and it goes over that, and then any required records. So this workshop isn't going to go into the harvest and post-harvest ag water requirements with the testing. If anybody has questions about that, I did pull up a few resources that I have on how to test, where you can take it, and some tips and stuff like that. So we can talk about that later. So what I used to put this workshop together was the FDA Ag Water Assessment Builder. And I like the paper-based one. They have an online one and two, but that doesn't work for me. I have to have the materials in my hands so I can look at them for me to wrap my mind around them. And so I have it, we can look at it later if anybody's interested, but I pulled up a copy of that. It took me a whole day to digest the document, the Ag Water Builder, Assessment Builder. So there's a lot of information in there, and it's a little bit confusing between an inspection and an assessment and the difference, even with the tool. But after a day of trying to figure it out and work through it, I finally figured it out, and I feel pretty confident about how it goes. And so we can look at that later, but the assessment builder is organized into different tables. So right off the bat, table B goes over exemptions. So these are farms that are subject to the regulation, but could be exempt from doing a pre-harvest water assessment. And so you're exempt, obviously, if you're not subject to the produce safety rule, or if your farm's qualified exempt. You don't need to do have a record of a water assessment. You're exempt if the water that you're using doesn't touch the edible portion of the crop. So if you're using drip irrigation and your system never fails and sprays water all over your crop, then you don't need to do an assessment, unless you're doing drip irrigation on carrots, because that grows in the ground. And even though that's drip irrigation, it's still going to contact that edible part of the produce. And you're also exempt if the water quality that you're using has 0 E. coli and it's not likely to change prior to use. So that you could be using a groundwater source, a well, or a municipal supply. Both of them are likely 0 E. coli. Or you could be using water that's treated to achieve that 0 E. coli, and the treatment process is monitored. So any of those scenarios, you would be exempt from having to do an assessment. And these are the final compliance dates. And it goes by farm size, and there's different dates just to make it super confusing for harvest and post-harvest water. That's the testing requirements. And the water assessment part of the regulation was finalized at a later date, and so that's why these dates are a bit delayed. And FDA just sent out a notice saying that even though for large farms, they're supposed to have to comply with the pre-harvest water assessment by April of this year, so like a few weeks ago. What they have stated is that they have to comply with it, but that farms that are being inspected this year, we're not going to be inspecting them based on that right now. We're not going to be assessing their assessment, I guess, until another year. So it's delayed for another year before any enforcement action is going to be taken, unless there's egregious conditions that are likely to make people sick. So another year extended onto that. And there's a whole ton of resources, of course, probably too many of them out there to help people get through this. So the FDA website is where I pulled that assessment builder. And they also have a few other resources on their website, pretty easy to find. They have a webinar recording, so if you learn by listening to things, that might be helpful to listen to. They have other resources that I included in the workshop packet when I did this workshop in person, and I can share them with Anna so that she can email them out in the follow-up email. But these resources are all available on the FDA website. So if you just Google FDA final ag water rule, they'll pop right up. So there's fact sheets on how to do an assessment, factors to consider when doing an assessment, corrective measures and mitigation measures, and assessment outcomes. So lots of stuff on the FDA website. And so there's a lot of other sources other than FDA where you could get some good resources. And the Produce Safety Alliance is, to me, they're like the authority on produce safety. So they're #1 place to go for resources. And so if you pull up the Produce Safety Alliance website, under resources, they have general resources, and you can scroll down to get to water. And so they have a few good resources that go over the difference between an inspection and assessment. And they also have a link to the Federal Register and the preamble, and that includes the whole history and basis for the regulation. And so when regulations are being developed, they go out for public comment, and all of those comments that the FDA gets are shared there, and FDA responds to all of them. So if you want to go into a deep dive into some of the history and the why behind the what, the preamble in the Federal Register is the place to go. And then also under resources, if you go to trainer resources, though, rather than general resources, they have an updated module from the Produce Safety Alliance grower training that goes over the finalized ag water rule. So you can go on there and see a recording. They have a manual that you can print off to update the grower training manual if you've taken that course. So those are all good things to check out. And if you pull up the PSA website, this is what you'll find under water. And I put a star here next to the good one. Good one. So there's resources related to food safety, the produce safety rule, ag water. And then there's the other one for the difference between inspection and assessment. Those are the two best ones right there. Another good place I found information. Whoops, I skipped ahead. Here we go. Was the Leafy Greens marketing agreement. And I still don't know exactly how this works, if there's much of a difference between the California one and the Arizona one and how they relate to Western growers. But the appendix for the Leafy Green marketing agreement, whether it's California or Arizona, has a lot of good resources. So it seems like this is where FDA pulled the information for the ag water assessment. So Appendix A walks you through how to do an ag water system assessment. So there's some good resources there. And then Appendix F of the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement has considerations for addressing effects of weather conditions on environmental sources of human pathogens. So that's a good resource to kind of wrap your mind around those parts of doing an assessment. Excuse me. So for me, when I first started looking at all this, I really was confused about the difference between inspection and assessment, even after going through the Produce Safety Alliance resource. But basically, I have it bulleted out here what the differences are. So inspection, like I said before, is relevant for pre-harvest, harvest, and post-harvest water. What you're doing is you're going out and you're inspecting the physical system that's actually under the farm's control, but you're also considering conditions that might pose a risk, including on adjacent and nearby lands that are not under the farm's control. And basically what you're doing is you go out and you look at it. And so then you come back after you've gone out to see what's going on and you do your assessment, if for just the pre-harvest water only. And so an assessment's based on the findings that you saw and the maintenance that you're performing on your system, and you're evaluating the conditions that might pose a risk. You might not know for sure if it's going to be a problem, but you might suspect something could be risky. So you're just thinking about what you saw and putting those thoughts down on paper. So the intent of both inspection and assessment is to identify conditions that are reasonably likely to introduce um, known or reasonably foreseeable hazards onto produce or the food contact surfaces. So you want to be looking at it from both of those perspectives. You don't want water to be contaminating the surfaces that produce will touch or the produce itself. So both an inspection and assessment could trigger like repairs or maintenance to your system, or other actions to control any potential hazards you've identified. And both of these are annual activities and they require documentation. And so I took some screenshots of the regulation just so you've seen it before. And so we're going to talk about inspection now, and that's in 112.42. And this was really confusing for me because that when you're doing an inspection, it has all these different elements that you need to take into consideration. And the degree of protection, the third one down, how to assess that is written in the assessment document. So these assessment and inspection resources are all linked together and it's hard to separate them from each other. So even though you're considering degree of protection when you're out doing the inspection, you're really documenting that under the assessment part of it. And I had a hard time with the FDA builder tool because I thought that there would just be 5 different sections for these elements of inspection, and it was a lot more. And so what they did was they broke up some of these elements into a lot of different sections. And so there's a lot more in the template that I have based on the FDA tool that got emailed out than what you see here. Um, the other challenge I had with this was, inspection is on the ag water system. And so um, I guess when you're looking at the harvest and pre-harvest water, that includes the whole building and your packing house. And so it's not just looking at the source. So when you look at these elements that they want you to inspect, take into consideration when you're doing an inspection, they seem like they would only apply to like a farm pond. Um, but you have to go back to what the definition of an agricultural water system is, and that's the whole source, through the distribution system to where it contacts the produce or the food contact surface. And so you have to inspect that whole system. I guess an example of this was I was doing an inspection and the farm had like a garden hose material that was connecting 2 copper sections of pipe in their packing house, and it had been leaking for a really long time, and the garden hose was just covered in slime and it was dripping down onto the floor right next to their pack line. And so if they had done an inspection of their whole agricultural water system, following it through the building and everything, maybe they would have caught it instead of me during an inspection. So that's the intent of this exercise. Um, and this is where I like to highlight, if you're having a hard time interpreting regulation, always go back to the definition because you'll probably find your answer there. And that's what this slide is. I have the definitions. And so here we've got agricultural water and agricultural water system. So the water is agricultural water if it contacts the produce of the food contact surfaces, and the water system means the source, the water distribution system, and any building or structure that's part of the distribution system, such as a well house, the pump station, the shed, any equipment used for application, all the way through it contacting food contact surfaces or covered produce. Maintenance, I'm not going to spend much time here. This is 112.42, so it's kind of a given that your equipment that you're using should be well maintained. And here I've got some examples of records for doing a water system inspection. And none of these record templates that you'll find on the internet are perfect. They all have problems with them, and that's what I've tried to highlight here in like the red and the green. So this record was put out by the Missouri Department of Agriculture, and highlighted in green are the elements that you're supposed to be considering when you do an inspection. So I liked that those were right on the record as a reminder to keep you on track when you're going out there. Everybody has a lot on their mind. And then highlighted in red, corrective actions don't need to be documented on the inspection record. So that's why you could open up a lot of space on this record to have more space for your observations if that wasn't there. So that doesn't really need to be there. And also this record does not require a supervisor review. So that doesn't need to be there down on the bottom, not required by the regulation. This is another inspection record, and I should probably update this, but I haven't. Produce Safety Alliance updated all of their templates, and I don't think they changed this one a whole lot, but we can look at that later. But this is a 2-page record, and I kind of like things that are 1 page if you can help it. But this one has a lot of extra information on here that might be helpful for some people to keep them on track. But for me personally, I like things that are very bare bones and simplified. And so general description of the water source on this one, that's something that you really need to put on the assessment and not the inspection record. Extent of control over the water source, that's another thing that really gets documented in the assessment. Degree of protection from hazards, same thing. And so I like having these considerations to keep you on track, but there's definitely some extra information on this one. And this is the 2nd page of the Produce Safety Alliance template for inspection. And I do like that you could have more than one on here, one water source. So you could have a bunch on here. But again, the actions taken don't need to be documented here on the inspection record. This example is from the Community Alliance of Family Farmers. They're out of California, and I like their records. Theirs aren't perfect either. So if you are a farm subject to the produce safety rule and you were using this template, there's no name and address of the farm on here. Just the field block. So you'd have to add that to be in compliance with the regulation. I like that it's 1 page front and I don't like that it's 1 page front and back per water source, because I have a lot of farms with a ton of water sources. So that would be a lot of paperwork. But I do like that this one's got a checklist kind of, so you can just kind of check off what applies to you and leave the rest. And I really like that it has a place kind of behind my red box here for observations and notes, because that's really the most important part of doing the inspection is documenting what you see when you're out there doing that. And so now that we've looked at some templates, what we're going to do is get into the fun stuff and do an inspection of my old dug well at my house. And so there's pictures, and I like to look at the pictures rather than the text on the screen. So hopefully this will be better. But we're going to go through the considerations for the nature of the water source, the extent of control, the degree of protection, adjacent land use, prior use, all of this stuff we're gonna go through. And so if you guys get a chance to take a look at the FDA assessment tool, it references inspection in the sections that I have up on the screen. So you can get some details that I've put into the cheat sheet from the assessment tool for how to do an inspection, which is totally confusing, but maybe it will be helpful if you know that going into it. So let's just get into the pictures. So hopefully you guys can see this all right. I don't know if I have screens, but this is a picture of my backyard. And what we're doing is we're standing on the edge of my leach field, which is marked with the rocks. And right next to the leach field is the manure pile from the 2 horses that I have. And you can kind of see 1 horse back there along the lower fence line. And you can see a little white house kind of in the middle center of the screen, barely. And that's my well house. My well's not actually in there. And it slopes downhill from the manure pile down to the well. So it looks pretty bad. And this is behind the well house. So this is the actual well. And just out of the view to the left is the old windmill. So this well is like 10 feet across and about 20 feet deep, which I believe is pretty big for a dug well, but I'm no expert. And so the building below my house next door used to be the old school. So this was the water source for the school. So it's got a cement cover, and this pipe that you see sticking up has no purpose other than there's a rope tied to it, and that's what suspends the water pump down below that cement cover. So when I got the house, it had a wood cover, and I replaced it with a cement one because it was all rotted out. So this is a close up of the cement cover and the rope tied off to the pipe. And this is the view from standing on the edge of the cement looking back up. So you can see the little well house. And that's like an electrical protects the electrical connection for the water pump. Doesn't serve any other purpose. And you can see the manure pile behind that uphill, and then the barn and my house and the trees. So that's what it looks like. And the distances between things are important. You can't tell that from the pictures. So there's about 10 feet between the edge of the cement well cap and the fence line. So there's a pretty good vegetation buffer here. And there's about 225 feet between the fence line and the manure pile. So those are the distances we're working with. This is a picture inside the well, so you can see there's nothing like sealed about this well. It's all fieldstone lined, and my cement cover fits fairly snugly, but it's not completely waterproof. And there's the wires and everything in there. So I was desperately trying not to drop my work phone in the well when I took that picture. Um, and so then now we're up to the manure pile. And what this picture shows is my horses have free reign here through the pasture. And I like to feed my horses a lot of food so they're fat and happy. And this picture was taken later in the fall. And what you can kind of see is that the grass is longer, taller below the manure pile because the horses won't eat it, where it's contaminated with bacteria from the manure pile. So it shows runoff in a visual kind of way that you can see where normally you wouldn't be able to. So they won't eat that. And this next picture is all Hob. He told me to put the arrows in, and I think it really helps. And so this shows where the runoff is going down the hill, and where it kind of stops. And I don't, this isn't an exact science. I don't know if that's the limit of the runoff or just where it's diluted enough where the horses will eat the grass, but it gives you a visual of what runoff looks like and how far it goes. And so we've got some more distances here. It was about 33 to 36 feet from the edge of the runoff to the manure pile. So we went out, did the inspection. Now we're gonna document the findings from the inspection of my well. Excuse me. So the source has a dug well. It could be under surface water influence because it's not sealed. Probably maybe some bugs could get between the cement cap into the well, but nothing big. No rodents or anything like that are likely to be able to get in there. But it's not sealed like a drilled well would be. Distribution system is closed. The pipes are intact. The extent of the control over this, it's fully under my control. It's on my land. Degree of protection is, I would call it partial, mainly because it's a dug well and it's not sealed. It's stone lined, so there's no well casing. I do regularly monitor it when I'm out doing the horse chores so I can see what's going on down there. I've got the 2 horses, the fencing for a 10-foot vegetation buffer. I've got backflow prevention devices installed in the house. And then the manure pile is uphill about 235 feet away. That's kind of what that's looking like. Adjacent land is woods, and there's the 2 residences, my house and the neighbor's house, horse pasture, manure pile, and prior use of the water is none. I'm the only one using this well, so nobody else is using it. So is the water safe? Maybe. We're gonna have to do an assessment and think about what we saw. And I would like to point out, like this is my drinking water, and so this should be like harvest, post-harvest water source. But for the purpose of this exercise, I'm considering it pre-harvest water, like if I was using it to grow crops. But the use is important because it could be safe for one use and not another. And so I might be able to use this well for pre-harvest water if it's not safe for drinking water for harvest and post-harvest water, if it doesn't meet the zero E. coli. So it depends on what you're using the water for. Um, whoops, keep scrolling. So we're going to do the assessment of my well. And just remember, inspection and assessment, you can't have one without the other. They really go together, even though they're separate records. And we're going to use the questions from the assessment to determine the degree of protection during the inspection. I don't know if you guys printed off the resources that go along with this, but that's what I'm talking about here. And the assessment template is one of those resources. And if you go out and do an inspection, you should take the assessment resources with you so you don't miss anything and have to go back out there when to catch anything that you forgot. And this is the assessment requirements are 112.43. So this is just a screenshot of that. And this is where you'll see the degree of protection broken out into a bunch of different things I can't read on the screen right now because they're too far away. But that's why there's so many different sections on the template for how to do an assessment. Um, and so you can do testing as part of an assessment. You don't have to. And so originally, the produce safety rule was going to require extensive testing of pre-harvest water. But there was a lot of industry kickback about that because of the expense and the time and the logistics. And so FDA took into consideration all of that feedback and decided that an assessment would be possibly even better than requiring water testing of pre-harvest water. And that's because usually pre-harvest water is like surface water sources. So testing is just one moment in time of one small, section of that source. And so doing an assessment might be more likely to catch things than just relying on water testing alone. But testing, even though you don't have to do it for pre-harvest water assessments, is really the best way to get to know your water source better. And so what we're going to do is follow my testing journey for me getting to know my well. And so in 2007, I bought the house and I did the full residential water testing that you have to do to get finance. And you can see that my E. coli is absent. So that means 0. And I tested, the residential test has all these other things. And the method for the testing is important because you have to do a certain method to be in compliance with the produce safety rule. And this 9221 is the one that tests for presence or absence, and you can use this. 9223 is the one that quantifies, and we'll see that in a little bit here. So in 2009, after 2 years, I decided I should probably check the water again. The realtor pulled the sample for the sale of the house, and I was like, I don't know where that water sample came from. So I wanted to make sure it was still safe. And so I tested it again. I did the full residential test and I got 0 E. coli again. It's absent. So we're good to go. I circled the pH on here. My pH is a little high. That seems to go, well, I haven't tested it again. We'll see in a minute. I've gone back to basic water testing, but I probably should check that pH. It's probably corroding my pipes. So 2009, I went a while in between here. 2014, I started working for the state doing retail and manufactured food inspections for food safety. And so by this time, I knew about the basic water safety test, which is the one we require for a food license. And so I was like, oh, it's cheaper than doing a residential test. And so I did just the basic water safety test. And that's nitrate, nitrites, pH. My pH was 7.06, which is perfect on this one. And E. coli is generic E. coli is absent again, but I was present, I had presence for coliform. And so I shocked my well because I was like, oh my goodness, I have coliform in my drinking water. And let me tell you, shocking this well was a nightmare. Mostly because the well is so far away from the house. It's like 400 feet away from the house, and I didn't have enough hose to get down there. So I had to lug buckets of chlorinated water to go try to splash off the inside surfaces of the well. So who knows how effective that was. Um, but I didn't retest it to find out, and maybe I should have. Whoops. These pictures are harder to, okay. And so after shocking the well, I decided I probably should test it again. So in 2016, I did another basic water safety test, but this time it was a drought year. And so I was like, man, if I test the water, and I get another positive coliform, I'm not going to be able to shock the well because I don't have enough water in the well to be able to flush it. And so I had a bit of an epiphany here, and I was like, oh, I can quantify the generic E. coli and the coliform to find out how much I have in there, and that would be helpful for me to make a decision on if I really need to shock it or not. And so I quantified it. It's like $5 extra to do that, and I only had one colony forming unit of coliform, and I was like, okay, I am not going to worry about that because I'm not feeding other people. It's just me, and so yeah, I wasn't concerned. And I did do some research on that though, not after this 2019 test. Um, I guess I'll skip over that for a second. So in 2019, I did the coliform and generic E. coli again, and I quantified it again. I got the same thing. I got one for coliform and less than one for generic E. coli. But I also tested for uranium and fluoride because those were the ones that were not on the residential water testing that I did. And those were the other ones that the A&L laboratory offered. And so I wanted to see where I was with that. And so all good there, but I got the one colony forming unit of coliform again. And so after that, I did some research and I was like, where is this coliform coming from? And so my research led me to leaf litter. And so I started going down and raking the leaves away from my well every fall. And then in 2023, when I tested it again, I got less than one coliform, and so that's basically zero. So I was like, huh, maybe my management of my well is effective. And so I should do a whole lot more water testing to confirm that if you can confirm it. But it's been an interesting journey for me using this old dug well, and I hope that sharing my testing results show you, you know, how valuable testing results can be for making decisions and getting to know your water source. Um, I think that for this well, if I was going to do some more testing to really, um, worst case scenario, get a feel for it, like after a very heavy rain event, is when I should be pulling my water test to see if I'm having any coliform hits or E. coli hits from the manure pile after a really, really heavy rain event. So that's what I should do to feel a little bit better about using this water source. But I do drink it. Um, and so testing is part of assessment. So I forgot because it's so sunny out and there's only a few people here, but um normally I ask, you know, how do you feel about my well after you see the pictures of it? But how do you, you know, I'm wondering how people feel about my well after seeing the water testing results. So if you thought maybe it was a little bit alarming to have the water source below the manure pile, like downhill, and you're like that's really bad. But then we looked at my water testing results, so maybe we're feeling a little bit better about the setup in my backyard. Um, and so based on my testing results, you could use this water for harvest and post-harvest water uses. And so, like I said, I am drinking this water and not having any ill symptoms. And if I was a farm subject to the produce safety rule, um, Oops, my Teams is giving me a different message for something else. And what would I have to do? What would I have to do if I was going to use this water source to wash harvest bins? So that's where I would have to test it 4 times in the first year. And as long as all of those water tests came back as zero generic E. coli, I could continue to use that water source for washing produce and harvest bins, as long as I, kept testing it once a year after that first year. And I thought this was kind of silly, right? This requirement to test it 4 times in one year until this past inspection season. I saw a couple of sketchy wells, and I was like, okay, it is important to test 4 times in a year to build out the water profile. I ran into a few farms that can't pass a water test without shocking their well. And that's a definite indication that you have a problem with the well that needs to be fixed. So if you can test it 4 times in a year, you should be feeling pretty good about your well if those all come back zero generic E. coli. So it is important to do that step. Um, and so I don't know if you guys printed off the assessment tool, the template that went out with the email if you registered, but I'm just going to run through this real quick. This is what I could enter for those sections of the template for doing an assessment on what you just saw from the pictures. So for C, this is the description of the water source. So on my assessment template, I would put it's a dug well, stone lined, about 20 feet deep, 8 feet wide, unsealed cement cover. It's under my control and it's partially protected. For section D, description of distribution system, I would put that it's closed, copper pipes into the residence. It's under Lindsay's control and it's protected via backflow prevention. For section E, equipment, buildings, and structures, I would say the well house doesn't seem to have a purpose other than electrical access. It had a partial roof replacement in 2023 and a door repair in 2024 to keep rodents out of it. Section F, animals. I've got the 2 horses and my cat named Orange. And Michelle, that works with me, was mad that I didn't put the horses' names in here. So they're Wishy and Mo. And I probably have some, field rodents and stuff like that, but not many. The horses keep it grazed down pretty low, so not much habitat for them. And I have a little bit of wildlife that goes in and out, but not a whole lot. Section G, biological soil amendments of animal origin. Well, I've got the manure pile, and that's 235 feet from the well, and it gets hauled off every spring. Human waste systems, I've got the leach field next to the manure pile. It's about 250 feet from the well. I last had it pumped in 2024. It's in good condition. No indication that the neighbor's leach field is having issues. I checked it out when I was dog sitting for them and everything looked good over there. And their leach field's about 200 feet from my well. So it turns out that I really think these code enforcement officers know what they're doing to keep well sources safe from sewage disposal. Section I, land application of human waste. There's none here. Other water users, none. Other potential sources of known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. I didn't see any. If anybody saw some looking through the pictures, please, feel free to unmute, holler what you saw that I should be concerned about. Crop characteristics. So this is like a pretend scenario. So we're going to pretend that I'm growing lettuce and cantaloupe. Both of those are susceptible to surface adhesion because of the texture of the produce. But the soils that I have here, it's sloped land and the soil drains really well, so it's not prone to pooling. So pooling water is really what's going to up the microbial level in the soil and could be a problem for your crops, depending on the crop and how close it grows to the ground. The edible portion does anyways. And so crop characteristics really throw a lot of people. So I just want to caution you that you don't have to get too wrapped up in it. Just keep it simple. Just be thinking about the characteristics, but don't go down a rabbit hole with that one. Ag water use practices. So are you using it overhead irrigation right up to the day of harvest? For this scenario, I could be, even if I was growing lettuce and cantaloupes and using my well water for that purpose. Environmental conditions. This is the other one that I don't, think people need to get too wound up about. Um, the manure pile is far enough away from the well so that runoff from more frequent heavy rain events is probably not an issue. Um, and I haven't had, if I was growing lettuce and cantaloupe, we haven't had any weather events that would have damaged the crop, like hail or something like that. And I think that probably some of these weather events that could damage the produce tissues would likely render that produce unmarketable. So maybe not such a concern there other than your crop loss. And the water quality from my well does not necessitate a microbial die-off period. That's something that we talk about in a grower training course. And if anybody wants to dive into that, we can do that shortly here. So other relevant factors I wrote in here, none. I'm sick of this, meant as a joke, but it is arduous going through all of this assessment stuff. And so once you've got your inspection done and your assessment done, there's assessment outcomes. And I don't know why this is blurry. Maybe I should have my glasses on, but outcomes of the assessment are in 112.43C of the regulation. And FDA came out with a handy little flow chart. I like the colors. And so after you do your assessment, you're determining if your water's not safe because it's not of adequate sanitary quality for how you're using it. You have to immediately stop using that water and implement some corrective measures before you can use it again. So that's one outcome, that it's not safe. Hopefully that doesn't happen to you when you do an inspection and assessment. Another outcome is that there's issues on adjacent or nearby land that's likely to introduce a hazard from animal activity or soil amendments of animal origin or human waste. So something nearby related to humans or animals. And so if you find that, then you would need to implement mitigation measures promptly and no later than the same growing season. So a little more risky with those scenarios. And so you want to try to control the potential hazards more quickly. But you can still keep using the water while you figure that out. And then if there's other conditions that are related, reasonably likely to introduce known or reasonably foreseeable hazards that are not related to humans or animal activity, then you have a little bit longer to implement mitigation measures to control those hazards to the best of your ability, as soon as practicable and no later than the following growing year. And you can use the water tests as part of your assessment here to determine if the measures are needed. And the last one outcome you can have is that you don't see any hazards that you need to worry about. And so you're in the green box and good to go until next year when you have to do your annual assessment all over again. These are just pictures of the text of the regulation. We don't need to go through that, but at least you've seen the regulation before. So I want to go over some scenarios, like what would it look like to come across a scenario where the water was not safe? And these come from the FDA Assessment Builder tool. So if there was like a sewage overflow or a leak upstream from where you pull the water, that would be an unsafe scenario where you would be in the red box and you would not want to use that water without some corrective actions. If you had a dead deer in your farm pond, that's something that would be a not safe scenario unless you hauled the deer out and tested the water to make sure it was good to go. If the septic system fails near the water source, that would be not safe. Or if there's a significant amount of animal waste introduced into the water source. So this is significance, not like a few deer droppings. This is something more, a bigger volume, like a manure lagoon leak or a nearby confined animal feeding operation. And there could be others. There's too many different scenarios that can happen on farms, but those are some examples of ones that would be not safe. And if you ran into those situations, again, you'd have to immediately discontinue the use of that water and take a corrective measure, fix it if it's not safe. And so these are some corrective measures that you could take if the water was not safe. So you'd have to re-inspect the whole affected system and make the necessary changes. So if the hazard's under the control of the farm, you could make repairs, you could remove the source of the contamination, you could treat the water. And if it was something that's not under the farm's control, all hope is not lost. You might be able to build a berm to reduce runoff from adjacent lands. You might be able to install like a windbreak, so you're not getting as much like dust from a manure pile on an adjacent farm blowing onto your crop. And you could also treat the water. And this is Sandidate 12.0. This is the first approved pesticide water treatment for irrigation water. So there is something out there if you find yourself in a situation where your water source was compromised somehow, but you need to use it, you could treat it with Sandidate 12.0 and be able to continue to use that water source as long as you are monitoring the treatment to make sure it was effective. So just something to be aware of that that's out there. And so for reasonably foreseeable hazards, so it might be an issue. So you're in the yellow or the orange box, I believe. I can't see my colors anymore. And so if it's related to human or animal poop, you've got to take those mitigation measures the same season, not related to them, as soon as practical, or within a year, the assessment date. And what these mitigation measures could look like are going to be similar to the corrective actions for if your water's not safe. Um, and so you could change the application method. So you could switch to drip irrigation rather than overhead, and that would mitigate the hazard potentially. You could make repairs. You could increase the time between application of the water and harvest of the crop. You could treat the water again. And just a heads up here, if you're going to use commercial washing, or increasing the time between harvest and the end of storage to as a mitigation measure, you have to have studies specific to your farm to support that. So you'd have to do a lot of testing, which is really expensive. So probably not applicable for a lot of farms, but there are some bigger industries like the wild blueberry industry that use commercial washing data for their whole process. So we're going to go over the outcome, the assessment outcome of my well. So is the water safe for intended use? So pre-harvest water, yes, it is safe, even with my manure pile. And I put a little asterisk here, FDA assessment tool, note 33 says that even if you have like a manure pile like I do, which is a source of contamination, as long as it's far enough away from the water source and properly mitigated, then it could be fine. And that's why I have that the situation at my house is safe for pre-harvest use. And for harvest and post-harvest use, maybe. For what I have for water testing results, it's looking pretty good, but I would have to test it 4 more times. Well, 4 times in 1 year to see if I can consistently have that zero generic E. coli to be sure that it's okay for harvest and post-harvest use. Um, and so yeah, I think it's really important to know the FDA is not expecting no hazards to be there, but you can mitigate them with distance and other things like that to be able to use the water safely. So are there one or more known or reasonably foreseeable hazards related to animal activity, soil amendments of animal origin, or untreated or improperly treated human waste? So no, it's been mitigated because I have enough distance between my manure pile and my well, and I have the vegetation buffer. Probably I could add a little bit more security and maybe I could ditch below my manure pile so I could send any runoff away from the water source a little bit more. So that's something I could do as an extra precaution, but I don't feel like I need to based on my testing results. And are there one or more known or reasonably foreseeable hazards not related to animal activity or untreated human waste? No, not that I could see from doing going through the whole thing here. But I did want to go through some different scenarios at my house. So let's pretend the manure pile was within 100 feet of the well. So generally wells are influenced by what's within 100 feet of them. So if the manure pile is that much closer, it could be a problem. So that would be a big red flag for me, that a mitigation measure would need to be taken. And if the manure pile was within 20 feet of the well, I'm pretty sure none of my water tests would ever have come out at all clean. Um, if there's a dead deer next to the well, probably not a great situation. Probably depend on the weather that we've been having, on if anything could get into my well. And if there's a dead deer downhill from the well, but within 20 feet of it, that's something that I just don't know. I'd have to phone a friend and call a hydrogeologist and be like, what do you think? And maybe I could test the water to be super safe, and confident to use it again. If my neighbor's septic system failed, I guess it would depend on how bad the failure was, and how close it got to the well. Their system was like 200 feet away from my well. So maybe if it overflowed for 100 feet and there was another 100 feet between the edge of the spill and my well, I'd be okay. But should be okay. I can't. It would have to be really bad for it to get that close to the well, and that's what gives me confidence in how code enforcement officers determine where things can be installed. 200 feet seems to be pretty safe. If we start having more heavy rain events, which seems to be the trend that we're going through lately, maybe the runoff for the manure pile goes farther down the hill, and I feel like right now, with the distance that I have between the manure pile and the well, I shouldn't have to worry about it. But if the pile was a little bit closer, then definitely I would be concerned about more heavy rain events washing the runoff down into the well. And possible mitigation measures. Of course, I always jump ahead and get into this, but I could divert the runoff, digging a ditch. I could fix the wellhead so that it's sealed. I could fix a leak in the pipe system. This is different scenarios still. So if I had a leak in my piping system, I'd be able to fix it. And I could change application method and timing if I was actually growing crops to mitigate some of these concerns that we just talked about. So those are some different scenarios. And so there's a lot of different resources out there that I didn't go over earlier. So Michigan State University has a risk prioritization tool online, and I didn't have much luck with the tool, but they have some scenarios with videos that I thought were fantastic. And I talked to Phil Toko. He said that I could use this stuff. And so I don't know if you guys want me to run through this, but I just had the scenarios from their videos. It's 6:04. So I think what we'll do is we'll stop and see if there's any questions. And then if people want me to go through those scenarios, I can do that. We have a couple people on. Does anybody have a question that they want to ask? You can put it in the chat if you want. There's nothing in the chat. Okay. All right. Well, I will run through these scenarios real quick and then show you guys some records. We can go over what went out with the email. So this tool that Michigan State University put together has so many considerations that they built into their tool. These ones on here are just a few of them. There's a lot more, but I want to get into the scenarios. So in this scenario, they have an unlined farm pond that's used for overhead irrigation of the little farm patch over here. And they have grazing cattle that have access to the farm pond. And there's septic fields that are 50 years old from the housing development, kind of adjacent to the property line in the farm pond. And so that's a scenario here. And so kind of risky. And the ways that Michigan State University suggested you could mitigate the concerns would be, one option would be to line the pond. And so when you line the irrigation ponds, you're minimizing what can seep into the water source, so that can protect it. Best thing you could do is prevent the cattle from being able to access the farm pond. So they should be fenced so that they can't access that. And then this last example is highly unlikely. I think that the septic fields in the adjacent housing development could be updated to public sewers, but obviously that's going to be a very costly endeavor. So that's one scenario. In the second scenario, we have a stream kind of going through this little valley here. And so the stream water is used for overhead irrigation. It flows through a residential area before it gets to the farm. There's a waste treatment facility that's been cited for overflow discharge into the stream. And there's a lot of deer and car collisions in this area, and there's heavy recreational use of the stream. So here, what they suggested to mitigate the concerns would be, big one is to repair the waste treatment facility, because it's going to make it really tricky for the farm to use that water source if that's an ongoing problem. Manage the deer population. This one throws me a little bit. I mean, are these deer getting hit and all going to die in the stream? I don't know. It seems a little bit of a stretch. But hopefully that's not the case. And then you could change the irrigation method, and that probably be the most the easy mitigation measure for the farm in this scenario where there's a lot that they can't control. Recreational use of the water, generally, if the water's safe to swim in, it's safe to use for pre-harvest water. So I wouldn't be as concerned about recreational use, but definitely the housing development and the waste treatment plant would be big concerns for this scenario. And the last one is a well. And so we've got well water that's being used for overhead irrigation. And the well is not that old. It was drilled in 1947. We don't know if it's cased or uncased. It's about 40 feet deep in sand and gravel. And there's a river a quarter of a mile away. And so the level of the water in the well goes up and down with the river level. And so that suggests that it's influenced by the surface water source. And so E. coli and coliform were tested 5 years ago, but I guess they don't know what the water quality is right now. And there's cattle grazing again upslope, and these cattle can graze right up to the wellhead. And so the scenarios to mitigate the concerns here would be maybe put a well house around the well so the cattle can't get right up to it. I don't think that that would be fully effective. I think you'd need more of a vegetation buffer than just putting up a well house. You don't want those cattle to be getting close to the wellhead. Or you could drill a new well if you had tons of money and have it capped in and somewhere else where it wouldn't be affected by the river water. So that would be a deeper going down into um, the aquifer. And so you can kind of see that in the picture. We've got the surface water aquifer that's influenced by the river, and then there's the lower aquifer. And so a new well would go deeper down into the ground to have that protected, to access that protected water source. So those are the scenarios. I don't have my contact information anywhere on here. And we have 20 minutes. So if you guys just holler if you've got any questions, I'm going to pull up some other things to show you. Or Hob, if you've got anything you want to add in there, take it away.
No, I don't. So let's see if folks have any questions.
Okay. Please feel free to holler. I'll just throw up some other things if I can get them into my little box here. So what I have here, I'm not going to read through all of this, but these are those FDA resources that you can find on the FDA website. So this first one, I think, is the fact sheet. So it just goes over agricultural water systems, water practices, crop characteristics, what's on an assessment. So a repeat of all the stuff that I just went through. So that's one resource. Oh, they all pulled up. This is going to be so easy. So maybe this is the fact sheet one. So this one goes over the agricultural water system. So these are all, I think, the inspection elements. And gives you additional information on what to consider. So this is going to mirror the cheat sheet that I made. I tried to condense this all into one kind of a page that you could take with you when you go out and do an inspection. So yeah, this is going through all the different elements with more detail than the fact sheet that I showed before. So more in-depth information. And then the third FDA resource goes over the corrective measures and mitigation measures that you might have to take if you find yourself in one of those situations. There's corrective measures and then mitigation measures. So these are the ones that are on the FDA website. And this is the paper-based tool that I used to put the workshop together. So I made my own assessment template because there wasn't one out there, and I needed to put this together for the Ag Trade Show in January because I was doing the workshops in person. So I can show you that record next that Produce Safety Rule came out with. But this is the assessment tool, and it's long. What is it, 22 pages? So there's a lot in here. But like I said before, it's split up into tables. And so the way I did the template, I wanted to follow the tables so that if you were going through an FDA inspection, it pretty much mirrors the regulation. So you can make sure you don't miss anything. So this is the tool, and here's some C7. This is for agricultural water source. And this right here is all of the stuff that's related to doing an inspection rather than assessment. So those are the considerations that I put into the cheat sheet that you can take with you when you do an inspection. So it goes on and on and on. I wonder if I can just scroll through after all the tables. Crop characteristics. Then it goes through the outcomes. And then outcomes without testing. And I want to get to this is the notes section. Okay, and this is like the appendix of the tool. And so these are all the notes that give you a lot of information. I don't know, here they are, appendix. The appendix has a bunch of notes, and this is where you can get a lot of information about how FDA interprets, what's a safe situation and not a safe situation. So the example scenarios I pulled from here, and this is where there was note 33 that talks about my manure pile being safe. So we note that if a farm identifies a potential source of contamination, it is not a foregone conclusion that measures under 112.45 are reasonably necessary. So rather, the farm must consider all of the information evaluated and making determinations on assessment outcomes. And so that's why I'm able to make the conclusion that even though I have that manure pile uphill from my water source, specific to my scenario, taking into consideration the water testing and the distances, mean that is not a reasonably likely hazard for this scenario. So super important that they threw in this little blurb buried in this document. That's very, very important. So those are the PDFs, and then somewhere around here I've got the Word documents, and maybe what I can do is slide this one over here. Sorry, everybody, I am not graceful doing this, but we'll get there. So this is the pre-harvest agricultural water assessment template that I put together because none was available. And so that was sent out via email to everybody that registered. And you can see I've got the tables from the assessment tool that I just showed. And so it kind of goes through and prompts you on all the information that you need to document in here. And then I have a whole second page where you could write in any corrective actions and mitigation measures taken here. And there's an extra page. So that's the template that I put together. So it's front and back, one page per water source, and then this extra page could go for any water source. You just have to make enough details down in here in this box. So that's that one. And then is this my cheat sheet? It is. And these are not gonna slide over like my PDFs did. Oh, it did. Okay. So this is my inspection cheat sheet. And so I took all of the inspection information that's in the assessment tool and brought it over here so that you could take it out in the field with you without having to take a 22-page document and trying to flip through to remember to capture all the information you need. So this is a front and back one pager, and it gives you all the prompts on the information you need to collect while you're out in the field to be able to complete your assessment. So hopefully that's helpful for everyone, because this is how my brain works. I want it on one page so I don't miss anything, because I always get distracted and forget what I should be looking at. So that went out in the email. The water assessment exercise that I put together kind of goes with my food safety plan workshop that I did a couple of weeks ago. But I like to bring this over because it goes over the die-off. And so I did the die-off, and this is opening a can of worms every time I go into the die-off conversation, but people need to hear it a few times to be able to wrap their minds around it. So so generally the best science that we have on water safety is if it's safe to swim in, it's safe for irrigation use where it contacts the produce. And so that cutoff is 126 colony forming units of generic E. coli is the cutoff for recreational water. And so if you're testing your pond water and your generic E. coli is regularly coming in below that, you should be fine to use that water up to the day of harvest. And if you're getting test results higher than that, you might be able to continue to use the water source, but just stop using it a few days before harvest. And so I did the math out on what that looks like. And I can't, I've forgotten how to do logarithms, but I can do percentages. And so these percentages are out of the grower training course, if you've taken that. And so one day of die-off would be adequate if your generic E. coli was below 394. And so I haven't, for all the water tests I've seen in Maine, we really are generally below that. 2 days, your generic E. coli would have to be below 1200 for 2 days to be adequate. And so this is not like black and white guaranteed that you'd be safe. If your generic E. coli was 1231 and you did 2 days of die-off, I would feel better if it was closer to maybe 800, and I would have more confidence in using 2 days of die-off and feel safe. But I just wanted to point out what those numbers look like if you multiply them out and do the math. So die-off is 68% die-off is equivalent to half a log. So you've got 32% of the bacteria remaining in theory. And they're dying off because they're drying out, or the UV radiation is killing them. There's a lot of things that kill off that bacteria once it's sprayed onto the crop, competing microorganisms and all sorts of stuff. So that's the quick and dirty on that. People can reach out to me if they want to go deeper into that. Water testing. This resource is up on the website. So I've got listed out the labs in Maine that are accredited, not that that's a requirement, but I know that all of these labs use the method of water testing that is adequate for the produce safety rule. And I go into some details about that below, which I'm not going to read through here, but I've got some tips on sampling, on testing surface water, whether it's for gap audits or for the produce safety rule. So hopefully this resource can clear up some confusions. I get a lot of questions about, do I have to test 3 times a year for the produce safety rule? Or do I not have to test anymore if I'm subject to the produce safety rule, but I'm still getting a gap audit? So there's some different requirements for a gap audit in the produce safety rule, and you want to make sure you're clear on that. So you still have to, that's the thing for GAP. If you're doing a GAP audit for your farm, GAP audits don't care if the water is going to touch the produce or not. It's still considered agricultural water and needs to be tested for a GAP audit. So super confusing with two different definitions of agricultural water, depending on if you're in the produce safety rule or doing a GAP audit. So there's that tip sheet. And this last one is the Produce Safety Alliance template. So these are the new ones. This is what their new one looks like for agricultural water system inspection. So this one didn't change a whole lot, but they have a new one for agricultural water assessment template. So this looks very different from the one I put together, and maybe farms would like this one better. I don't know. It's totally up to you to find one you like or create your own. You could get ideas for these templates to make an even better one. So this is what it looks like now. It's got the elements and the factors to evaluate, a place for you to put your observations, and an assessment of your observation and how it could influence risk. And so there's one, two, I think it's just 2 pages there. So you have to do one of these for each water source. And then they've made a separate document where you can keep track of any corrective and mitigation measures. So they broke it out. So I like what they did with this much better than what they had before. So that's all that I have. Oh, we have a question in the chat.
No, it was just Tim mentioning that we
Okay.
didn't have any questions when we asked before.
Yeah. So that's a lot, but I think, a water doing an inspection and assessment, and inspection will be easy. An assessment the first time is going to be kind of a big task, but once you've done it that first time, unless something changed, it should be a breeze to go do your annual assessment thereafter. So it's just going to be the struggle to get through the first one, and nobody's expecting perfection. So just going out there and making your best stab at it is all anybody expects right now. So there's a lot of training that needs to happen, even for us inspectors. There's just so much that goes into this. So yeah, just do the best you can. That's what we're going to be doing as well, and we'll all get through it.
Yeah, I have just 2 things to say. One thing to say. One thing is a question follow up for Lindsay. Well, a bad water assessment is better than no water assessment. That really stuck with me when someone mentioned in a NECAF's meeting earlier this year. So just go out there, do the best you can. You are better off than someone who didn't do any of it. But just so the message doesn't stay as like everyone needs to do this, and for other folks maybe watching this webinar later, but Lindsay, like, who actually have to do this? Is it like everyone who needs to do this water assessment?
No, farms subject to the produce safety rule where the water contacts the harvestable portion of the crop.
Okay, yeah. So if you got overwhelmed during this, thinking that everyone needs to do this, just keep in mind that if you are not fully covered by the rule, you could do all of this. They're all best practices, but you might not have to. And if you have doubts on if you are fully covered or not, we can have that conversation. There are resources out there. You can reach out to me or to Lindsay to kind of figure out your situation, but not everyone growing produce and selling it will have to do all of this. In a way, only larger farms or people selling mostly to distributors. If you sell mostly locally, or you don't sell a lot in a very simplified way, you are not fully covered, and then you might not have to comply with all of this water assessment and all the other parts of the rule either.
For sure. Thanks, Hob. Yeah, for farms that do a regular GAP audit, that record that I pulled up with the die-off calculated out, it's a simplified water assessment for regular GAP, where you're just looking at the water source and how you apply it and what crop it's getting applied to. and you're just literally like documenting that without much assessment actually going on. But if you get into a harmonized gap audit, that's where it's gonna parallel closer to this with the stuff that you need to take into consideration. So if you've done a harmonized audit, this is gonna look more familiar. And maybe it will just be twisting it so that it's presented a little bit differently, but a lot of the same considerations when you truly get into an actual assessment of your water source and distribution system, the whole system. So, well, thank you so much, you few people who came out of the sun to come listen to this. I appreciate it, and Bob and I are always available if anybody wants to reach out. We love it when people call or email, so please do.